But obedience allows us to trust God on what God is doing in our life, not knowing the end circumstances of that. True believers know by experience that obedience must follow faith. How many times has your faith been challenged and you did not obey God? Boy, any of you ever been in that boat? It's not a good boat, is it? You know that's what God's calling you to. You're challenged by that. God has spoken to you very clearly and distinctively, as only God can do. He has placed before you not only an opportunity, but in biblical standards and wisdom. And He has placed you for such a time as this. Matter of fact, the Bible tells us that. And some, like Esther, would have said, "Oh Lord, I can't do that. I can't do that." She would have told everybody she couldn't do it. But she was reminded that God places people at the exact place He wants them, at the exact time He wants them, to do what He wants them to do. That's exactly what He did with Joseph and Mary. Exactly what He did. What if she had refused? What if he had refused? They would have not known the blessings. Because the reality is, folks, not only does obedience follow faith, obedience is not always comfortable. Boy, it's not, is it? It is not always comfortable. Have you ever heard, well, if that was me, I'd get even with them? Have you ever thought that? If that's me, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. That's dangerous for some of us. Not so much that what you might say, but you don't have a lot to spare, you know. The reality is that there's problems with that, isn't it? Because it's not always comfortable. Joseph first withstood the criticism and the judgment and the remarks of others. Can you imagine what it was like in that little town of Nazareth? Everybody knew everybody else's business. Does it sound like someplace you might know? Sure it does. Gossip ran rampant, didn't it? What a terrible thing it was. But whenever he came to that place, and as I mentioned a moment ago, others might have shunned him, he then had taken her to be his wife. And what we find out is that later in the Christmas story, what happened? There was something else happened. First of all, he had to deal with Nazareth. Secondly, he had to deal with a journey because Caesar had decreed that everybody had to pay taxes. And so he had to take a journey with his wife that was about to give birth down to a town of Bethlehem, which his descendancy was from, but he really didn't know anybody there. Probably about the time that they got back to Nazareth, although the Bible didn't tell us this, I believe they would have traveled back. He would not have stayed there. Then, about a year later, there were some guys from the east that came and saw the star, commonly referred to as the Magi or the wise men. And God had spoken to them, or had seen the star, and they come to worship Him. And they were looking for Herod, and Herod decided that no one else was going to be king, so he was going to kill all the children, all the male children. And guess what happened? God came to them with a small child and a wife and said, "You're not through traveling yet. Go on down to Egypt." Wow. You say, well, that's not a problem. Maybe they could have hopped a bus, got an airliner, something. Didn't work that way, folks. It was a long walk to Egypt, wasn't it? A long walk. And in order to take that walk, he knew he would not be back for a while. Guess what he had to give up? He had to leave his home. The home that they had made. They had just got settled in. The gossip had just died down a little bit. He had picked up his carpentry trade. He was back in business after that journey of tax paying and a child being born. And then all of a sudden, God said, wait, you're not through yet. Now I want you to go a little farther for me because you got to go farther in Bethlehem. You got to go down into Egypt because we've got to protect this child. Wow. Can you imagine, Joseph? What would some of you said about that time? Man, I can't get a break. I can't catch a break. Seems like everything I do just becomes more difficult and it becomes harder to serve God. And when we look at the circumstances, does it ever get that way? When doing the right thing, when doing the godly thing is difficult and uncomfortable? Does it ever get there for you? Well, if it doesn't ever get there for you, then you're probably not following the paths of God's leadership. Because let me tell you, sometimes it gets uncomfortable obeying God. Because sometimes you'll be in places that you don't want to be. You'll deal with situations you don't want to deal with. You'll have to do things that is not of your choosing, that are not comfortable, that are not easy. It's easier to hide out from them. It's easier to do something else. It's easier to ignore them. But obedience will not allow that, folks. Because ultimately the most uncomfortable place to be is outside the will of God. Outside the will of God. Now, there's not a lot of things that scare me as far as my life is concerned. You see, I really don't fear death because I know that my home is heaven. Would I regret leaving those I love behind? Sure I would. But I don't fear it. But there's only one thing in my Christian life that has ever scared me to death. And that's being out of the will of God. Being out of the will of God. For me to set the direction. For me to decide what I will do and what I won't do. For me to quit following the leadership of the Lord and telling God that I know better than He does. You say, oh, I would never ever tell God that I know better than what He does. You may not in words, but man, do we ever do it in action sometimes. Do we ever do it in action? And that means we're not living by faith, nor are we living by obedience. Because both living by faith and living by obedience, folks, become uncomfortable at times from a human perspective. It will cost us. It will cost us our comfort. It will cost us our being at ease. Matter of fact, the Bible even says to us at times, woe unto them who are comfortable doing the things that they are at, or at ease in Zion, the Scripture says, that are at ease in the things of God. For if you're at ease in the things of God, you're not being challenged to grow with God and to extend yourself beyond what's comfortable for you. And folks, listen, truly following God puts us in uncomfortable places in His kingdom and in our life. But what you find is that once you get in those uncomfortable places and you walk by faith, trusting God, you grow in your faith and you find out, you know what? That wasn't as nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. Have you ever been there? Sure you have. Now, some of you may not have tried some of those things that God has chosen to call you to do. Because the first answer you gave to God, whenever it made you uncomfortable, is you said, I can't. Now, to God, saying you can't doesn't say a lot about you. What you do is you say, God, you can't do that through me. And it says a lot about God, doesn't it? Can God do through you what God chooses to do if you will allow Him to do that? The answer is yes, He can. What is the single factor that keeps God from doing what He wants to do through you? It's a lack of faith in God and a lack of obedience to God. Joseph struggled with those, but by faith and obedience both, God released His promises in the life of Joseph. Obedience always releases God's promises, folks. Mercy, faith, and obedience are all important terms and important concepts in realizing the promises of God. You say, well, God was going to take care of that baby. Sure He was. But what a blessing Joseph must have had in order to be obedient to God, to know the blessings of God. Folks, don't cheat yourself out of the blessings of God by disobedience. Don't cheat yourself out of the blessings